I came home expecting peace and found a massacre. The forest I planted, the trees that sheltered wildlife, the soul of my land all gone, bulldozed, erased, and the ones who did it, not strangers, not loggers. It was my own hoa, and they had no idea what they'd just destroyed. It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend, one of those rare moments where life slows down, where your phone goes silent, and you reconnect with the earth, the air, and the rhythm of the trees. My lake ranch had always been that for me, my escape, my sanctuary, tucked quietly at the edge of a pristine lake, surrounded by towering evergreens and whispering leaves. This place wasn't just land. It was life. It was the product of years of love, effort, and healing, not just for me, but for the land itself. I had bought this 10-acre property years ago when it was little more than brush and mud. The lake shimmered, yes, but the trees were struggling, the soil was dry, wildlife was scarce. I had worked for years to restore it, tree by tree, plant by plant. I planted over 200 native species. I cleared the invasive weeds by hand. Slowly the land came alive, birds returned, deer started grazing. I even spotted a bald eagle once. The trees stood tall again, forming a lush green curtain around the edges of the lake, a forest reborn. But on that morning, none of that was there. As I drove down the gravel path that led to the property, something felt wrong. There was dust in the air, noise in the distance, the unmistakable sound of machinery, chainsaws buzzing, engines revving, and men shouting back and forth. I parked the car, jumped out, and ran down toward the clearing near the lake. And then I saw it. I froze. My trees, gone, every single one, the majestic tree line that had framed the lake like a living picture. Completely flattened. The same trees I'd watered during droughts, protected from storms, watched grow from saplings into giants, were now lying in torn heaps like discarded trash. The air was thick with sawdust and smoke. Roots had been ripped out of the ground, bark was shredded across the dirt. Tree stumps bled fresh, pale wood where once thick trunks stood tall. My boots sank into loose soil where bulldozers had plowed through without care. I was stunned, not angry, not yet, just absolutely stunned, like I had walked into someone else's nightmare. This wasn't my land, it couldn't be, but it was. I kept walking, trying to make sense of the destruction. Who would do this? Why? What authority could possibly have the power to destroy something so sacred, not just to me, but to the ecosystem? That's when I saw it. Nailed to the last standing stump, the one closest to the lake. My favorite oak was a bright orange notice, flapping gently in the breeze. I pulled it off, my hands trembling. The bold black letters read, "Property cleared under HOA Directive #77, B for aesthetic safety and neighborhood uniformity." And then it hit me like a punch to the gut. The HOA. The Homeowners Association, the same organization that once fined my neighbor for painting their shutters the wrong shade of beige, had authorized the complete clearing of a forest, my forest, without a call. Without a meeting, without even a courtesy email. They had sent out some vague notice a week earlier, something about general vegetation improvements. I remembered seeing it in a newsletter, tiny print, tucked between a landscaping update and a reminder to leash your dogs. I had skimmed right past it, because why would I think they were talking about my land? My 10-acre lot sat at the very edge of the HOA boundary, right where the neighborhood gave way to wild nature. My lot wasn't like the cookie-cutter homes up the hill. It was part of the neighborhood technically, but I had always been told it had special status. It bordered a state-protected reserve forest after all. That's why I bought it. That's why I fell in love with it. And now, the entire border, hundreds of trees, including a dozen endangered species I had helped document with state conservationists, was gone. I dropped the paper and stood in silence, and that's when the rage began to settle in. This wasn't just carelessness, it was a violation, a theft, a desecration of something irreplaceable. I looked at the exposed soil, the broken branches, the empty nests. This was my land, and it had been treated like an abandoned lot. I called the HOA immediately. No answer. I sent emails, texts, voicemails. No one responded that day. What made it worse was that some of the board members knew what this land meant to me. I had hosted a tree planting event here last spring. We had children come out to release butterflies. A local high school had done a nature photography project right here. One of those photos had even won a regional award, a shot of the exact tree they'd now cut down. I sat down on a tree stump and tried to catch my breath. The sound of chainsaws had finally stopped. The workers had packed up and gone. All that remained now was silence, not the peaceful kind, but the kind that follows disaster. And in that silence, I made a decision. This wasn't over, not even close. That night, I went through every file, every email, every legal document from when I bought the property. I dug up old survey maps, zoning declarations, and emails with the state forestry office. And then I found it buried in an email chain from 5 years ago, the protected land overlay document, signed and stamped by the state. It clearly marked a large portion of my property, the part they had just bulldozed, as within the reserve forest boundary. That meant the HOA had done more than cut down trees. They had broken the law. About a week before the disaster, I received an HOA newsletter, one of those long, dull emails you barely skim before deleting. It was full of the usual stuff: reminders about trash can placements, lawn maintenance suggestions, updates about upcoming community barbecues. Buried somewhere near the bottom, in the same font and tone as a pest control update, was a single line that read, "Routine land improvements and vegetation control will be carried out over the coming days as part of neighborhood beautification." That's it. No map, no list of affected properties, no mention of specifics, just a vague reference that sounded more like a landscaping update than anything serious. I didn't give it a second thought. After all, my land was different. My ranch sits on the outermost edge of the HOA development, a sprawling 10-acre stretch of land hugging the lake and leaning into dense woodlands. I had always been told, both verbally and in writing, that this part of the neighborhood had unique boundaries. It was considered an independent natural buffer, a quiet corner meant to remain untouched, separating residential development from the nearby state-protected reserve forest. When I bought the property years ago, that protected status was actually the main reason I fell in love with it. While other residents were fencing in half-acre lawns and arguing over hedge heights, I was planting trees. Not just any trees, native species that had once thrived in this region before development had wiped most of them out. I spent my weekends digging, watering, and nurturing the land. I had installed nesting boxes for birds. I'd even built a wildlife camera station to observe foxes and deer during dawn hours. My 10 acres weren't just land. They were part of a larger ecosystem, intricately woven into the health of the surrounding reserve. Over the years, I'd planted more than 200 native trees: oaks, red maples, sweet gums, and sycamores, each placed with care and intention. Some were as young as my nieces, and others had already matured into towering canopies that gave shade to the local wildlife. It had become a natural refuge for me and for the animals. I'd even hosted visits from local school groups, environmental volunteers, and once, a university botany department that wanted to study the successful reintroduction of rare undergrowth species. So imagine my horror when I realized that none of that history, none of that value, had meant anything to the HOA's so-called beautification committee. Apparently, while I was away on a work trip, this group of clipboard-carrying rule-obsessed board members had taken a walk around the neighborhood and decided that my land, with its thick greenery, tall trees, and slightly wild aesthetic, didn't match the manicured lawns and suburban symmetry they wanted. It looked, in their words, unstructured, overgrown, and potentially hazardous. Hazardous, really. What they were actually saying was, it didn't fit their vision. And when something doesn't fit the vision of an HOA, they don't ask questions, they take action. So without so much as a phone call, a knock on the door, or a courtesy meeting, they sent in contractors. Lawn crews, chainsaws, bulldozers. They authorized a full-scale clearing of what they ignorantly labeled excess vegetation. But this wasn't a few overgrown shrubs or a neglected backyard. This was a thriving forest. And they cut every single tree, every bush, every root, every native flower bed, wiped out in one day of blind destruction. No assessments, no environmental review, no check with local officials. Just orders from a group of untrained volunteers who wanted the entire neighborhood to look uniform. Let that sink in, because a handful of people on a committee thought my land looked too natural. They took it upon themselves to erase a decade of restoration work, destroy hundreds of native species, and disrupt an ecosystem that had taken years to revive. And they did it all without asking for my consent, without even informing me directly. When I first confronted one of the HOA board members, their response was almost laughable if it hadn't been so infuriating. "Oh, we thought the land was just neglected. One of them told me casually there were weeds and leaves and, well, we just assumed no one was maintaining it. We wanted to tidy things up. Neglected." I had a full-time gardener visit every 2 weeks. I had irrigation systems, composting methods, and seasonal planting schedules. This wasn't some abandoned lot, it was a certified pollinator habitat. It had been featured in a local magazine just last fall. And now it looked like a war zone. No birds, no shade, just dirt, sawdust, and stumps. I started getting emotional on that call, something I rarely do. I asked them how they could possibly think this was okay, how they could make a decision like this without consulting me or even bothering to check what the land actually was. They didn't have an answer, just stammering, awkward pauses, shifting blame between each other. One of them even tried to defend the move by saying, "Well, it technically falls within the HOA boundaries, so we have authority." Authority. Let me tell you something, just because you have power doesn't mean you get to ignore responsibility, and that's when something shifted inside me. This wasn't just a mistake, this was an act of negligence. One with legal, environmental, and personal consequences, because what they didn't know, and what they never even bothered to ask, was that a large portion of my ranch overlaps with a state-designated reserve buffer zone. That's right, protected land under state conservation law, subject to environmental preservation regulations. In other words, they didn't just cut down my trees, they may have broken the law. And at that moment, sitting on a felled stump in the middle of what used to be my own private forest, I made myself a promise. I was going to fight this, not just for myself, not just for the trees, but for every landowner who's ever been steamrolled by blind bureaucracy and arrogance disguised as authority. This was just the beginning. Here's where it gets interesting. You see, the HOA thought they were just doing some neighborhood maintenance. They thought this was about trimming trees and cleaning up a messy backyard, but what they didn't know and what they never even tried to learn was that those trees weren't just mine, they were protected by the state. When I purchased my lake ranch years ago, part of the reason I chose that specific plot was because of its unique location. Nestled on the edge of the community and brushing up against a large swath of undeveloped forest, a portion of my land overlaps with a designated reserve forest zone land protected under state environmental conservation law. It wasn't just a lucky accident. I knew exactly what I was buying. I had even worked with local environmental groups and the Department of Environmental Conservation to document the tree species, record wildlife sightings, and contribute data to the state's habitat registry. I wasn't just a landowner. I was a steward of that ecosystem, and here's the important part. Under state law, cutting down trees inside a reserve forest zone without express written approval is not just a minor violation, it's a criminal offense. Let me say that again. This wasn't just about HOA overreach anymore. This was an environmental crime. The moment I realized the extent of the destruction, I knew I needed to act fast. I contacted someone I had worked with during a wildlife preservation project 2 years ago, a forest officer from the Department of Environmental Conservation, a serious man, quiet and methodical, with a deep respect for the land. I sent him a message that simply read, "There's been a major incident on my property. Trees were cut, dozens of them inside the buffer zone. I need your help." He replied within hours. The next morning, he arrived with a small team of state officers. They brought measuring tools, surveying equipment, and a drone. We walked the land together, and I watched as his normally calm demeanor shifted to something more intense. His eyes scanned the tree stumps. His boots stepped carefully around the churned-up soil. His jaw tightened as he took in the extent of the damage. "This," he said after a long silence, "is going to court." Over the next few hours, we documented everything. Photos were taken of every stump, especially those that matched endangered or native species flagged for protection. Measurements were recorded, showing exactly how many trees had been felled. Drone footage was used to create an aerial view of the destruction, showing the clear, cut swath where a dense forest had once stood. Soil samples were taken from the wetland buffer near the lake, where bulldozers had scraped the topsoil and compacted sensitive terrain. The final tally, over 170 mature trees cut, at least 4 endangered plant species destroyed, significant disruption of a wetland buffer, which serves as a filter system for the lake and provides habitat to nesting birds and amphibians. This wasn't just bad, it was catastrophic from an ecological perspective. And all of it had happened under the directive of a local HOA that didn't even bother to send a letter or make a call. The forest officer filed a preliminary report that same day and told me the next steps would be legal and fast. The state doesn't take these matters lightly. Reserve forest zones exist for a reason to protect habitats, maintain biodiversity, and preserve natural resources that can't be replaced once they're gone. And the HOA? They had unknowingly violated multiple state laws, including illegal deforestation in a protected area disturbance of a state, designated wetland buffer destruction of endangered flora, and possibly interference with a certified wildlife habitat. I could barely believe it myself. They had sent in contractors, likely some general landscaping company, and bulldozed a piece of land that wasn't just beautiful, it was legally protected. They thought they were just trimming a yard. But they had just committed an environmental crime. When the HOA finally returned my calls, I didn't even speak to them. I had my lawyer do it, because by that point, this was no longer a neighborhood issue. It was a legal matter, and they needed to understand the gravity of what they had done. Their tone shifted immediately. Gone was the smug indifference, the dismissive attitude. Now they were panicked, confused, trying to backpedal. They claimed they didn't know, that it was an honest mistake, and that the land was assumed to be unprotected common space. But here's the thing about the law. Ignorance isn't a defense, especially not when you have a paper trail showing exactly who made the decisions, who signed the work orders, and who authorized action on land they didn't even verify. My lawyer made it clear we had evidence, we had environmental experts, and we had state officials backing us, and soon we'd have a courtroom. But even beyond the legal battle, I want to pause and reflect on something more important. This wasn't just about land or trees or HOA rules. This was about respect for nature, for boundaries, and for the people who actually care about preserving what matters. The HOA didn't care about the trees. They cared about how things looked, and in doing so, they destroyed something irreplaceable not just physically but spiritually. That forest was a living thing, a network of roots and leaves and life. And in one uninformed, reckless decision, they turned it into mulch and dust. And now they'd be forced to answer for it. The legal process would take months, maybe longer, but I wasn't going anywhere. And I wasn't backing down. The forest officer assured me that penalties for this kind of violation could be severe, including heavy fines, mandated reforestation projects, and possibly criminal charges for those directly responsible. And I would be there every step of the way, making sure every single tree they destroyed was accounted for. Because this wasn't just about justice. This was about sending a message to every HOA, every overreaching committee, every person who thinks they can bulldoze their way through land they don't understand. You don't get to erase nature. You don't get to destroy what you didn't build. And you definitely don't get to do it quietly, not anymore. Within 2 weeks, the first formal blow landed on the HOA doorstep. A thick envelope arrived at their office bearing the seal of the State Department of Environmental Conservation. Inside, a cease and desist order, effective immediately. All further activity, landscaping, vegetation removal, any land beautification initiatives were to stop. No more lawn crews, no more bulldozers. No more HOA cleanup committees swinging axes around protected ecosystems. But that was just the beginning. A full-scale investigation was launched. The state wasn't taking any chances this time. They had seen too many of these cases: arrogant boards, clueless contractors, and overreach hidden behind words like community guidelines. Environmental consultants began showing up at my property, walking the grounds, measuring root damage, examining tree rings to estimate ages. Some of those trees had been standing for over 70 years. Several were even older than the HOA itself. Legal teams arrived next, not mine, but those working for the state, federal environmental agencies, and even conservation groups I had once partnered with. Groups that had helped me restore the land, plant native species, and turn my property into a haven for wildlife. Now they were furious. Some of them had helped fund small restoration projects on my land, and now those investments were gone, bulldozed overnight by people who had no idea what they were destroying. Even federal wildlife authorities began circling in, because it turned out the HOA hadn't just cut trees. They had destroyed active nesting areas used by migratory birds, including species protected under the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, a federal law that makes disturbing those habitats a serious offense. In the middle of all this chaos, the HOA tried to spin the story. At the next community meeting, the HOA president, a man known more for regulating lawn gnomes than environmental policy, stood up in front of a room full of residents and tried to smooth it over. He said it was a misunderstanding. He claimed the board believed it had authority over the property, and the most outrageous of all, he said that I had verbally approved the clearing, a lie, a bold-faced, ridiculous lie. But here's where they made their biggest mistake. They underestimated how prepared I was, because while they were acting on assumptions and arrogance, I had documents. Emails to the HOA over the years clearly stating my land's protected status, property maps showing the reserve forest overlay, signed agreements from past HOA meetings confirming my parcel was exempt from uniform landscaping directives. Even an HOA landscaping survey that marked my land natural zone, no maintenance required. And the most powerful piece of all, drone footage. Footage from just a month before the destruction showing a lush, green, thriving forest. Compared with the footage after a graveyard of stumps and churned earth. I compiled everything and turned it over to the investigators. That was the moment when everything flipped. The fines started rolling in. One after another, $25,000 for illegal deforestation, $10,000 per endangered tree cut, and there were 12 of them confirmed, $75,000 for disturbing a wetland buffer zone, and a separate federal violation for destruction of a migratory bird habitat, which carries penalties up to 6 figures depending on severity. But it didn't stop there. Remember those conservation groups I mentioned? The ones that helped me restore the land, they filed lawsuits too, because several of them had grants and research permits tied to my property. And by destroying those trees, the HOA had not only broken environmental law, they had interfered with federally supported environmental projects. So now the HOA, once infamous for fining residents over mailbox color or grass height, was facing over $400,000 in combined penalties, lawsuits, and legal fees. The board started falling apart. The landscaping committee resigned. The HOA president lied up. Several homeowners began demanding an emergency election to remove the entire board. And can you blame them? People were furious. Not because they cared about the trees as much as I did, necessarily, but because now their HOA dues were going toward paying lawyers. Insurance premiums for the HOA skyrocketed, the community budget was frozen, the neighborhood improvement projects canceled, the annual block party gone, even basic maintenance services were put on hold while they scrambled to cover fines. The irony was brutal. All of this happened because the board wanted to beautify the neighborhood, to make everything look cleaner, more uniform, more polished, and now the HOA was the subject of news headlines, state investigations, and multiple lawsuits. Their finances were wrecked, their credibility destroyed, and their dream of neatness had turned into a national embarrassment. But here's the part that gave me the most satisfaction: accountability. For once, people who thought they could do whatever they wanted with no consequences were finally facing the music. No one had ever questioned them before. No one had stood up and said, "You don't get to do this." No one had forced them to look at the bigger picture beyond lawn guidelines and HOA politics. Until now, I became that person, and I wasn't alone. Neighbors who had once stayed silent began speaking up. Residents started pulling out old complaints about harassment, about fines for harmless things, about HOA board overreach. Turns out, I wasn't the first one they'd bullied, but I was the first one to fight back with the truth, with the law, and with evidence. And you know what the most powerful tool was? Documentation, emails, maps, permits, photos, drone footage. That's what protected me when they tried to twist the story. So here's a lesson for anyone listening: keep everything. Even if it seems minor, even if you think you'll never need it. Because when the moment comes when someone decides to mess with your land, your rights, or your values, receipts matter. Let me be clear, this isn't over. The legal cases are ongoing, restoration efforts are just beginning, and while the HOA scrambles to survive the mess they created, I've already started planning the reforestation of my land tree by tree. But now I'm not doing it alone. Environmental groups have offered support, volunteers have stepped in, even a local school has pledged to help plant new trees as part of a conservation project. The forest will come back. Maybe not overnight, but in time, and when it does, it'll stand as a living reminder that nature matters, that recklessness has consequences, and that even against boards, bulldozers, and bureaucracy, truth has roots. While the legal mess swirled around the HOA like a storm, I made a decision, one I didn't expect to make so quickly. I wasn't going to wait for courts or apologies. I wasn't going to sit in the ruins of my land, mourning what was taken. I was going to rebuild, but not just rebuild, restore and grow. It started with a plan, a complete reforestation of my ranch, not just replacing what was lost, but doubling it. I reached out to the state's Department of Environmental Conservation, and to my surprise, they offered more than just support. They offered resources, grants, expertise, access to native plant nurseries and conservation tools I'd never used before. Soon after, an environmental NGO I'd worked with in the past stepped in. They had followed the media coverage and said, "Let's make this bigger than just your land." And so we did. We weren't just planting trees. We were designing a habitat, native hardwoods like oak, maple, and pine carefully selected to bring back the canopy that once shaded the lakeshore, berry bushes and pollinator, friendly shrubs to feed the returning birds and bees, ground, cover plants and root, stabilizing ferns to heal the soil that the bulldozers had compacted and stripped, and perhaps most meaningful of all, bird-friendly flora, trees with wide branches and soft foliage, shrubs that offer cover, everything selected to restore what the migratory species had lost. What was once a heartbreak was quickly becoming a comeback story. Word began to spread. At first, it was just local media. A newspaper article titled "Lake Ranch Owner Fights Back with Forest." Then a regional news station came out to film the replanting effort. Volunteers, school groups, and wildlife experts working side by side, digging holes and placing saplings into the ground. Before I knew it, national outlets were reaching out. I was invited to speak on a morning show, a short segment about land rights, conservation, and standing up to bureaucratic overreach. That turned into an invitation to a conservation panel where I spoke alongside biologists, activists, and state legislators about the importance of private land stewardship. Suddenly, my story wasn't just mine anymore. It was everyone's. It became a case study, a cautionary tale, and more importantly, a symbol of how one person can protect something bigger than themselves. Back in the neighborhood, things were changing too. The HOA was unraveling, with lawsuits piling up and media attention painting them as the villains. The pressure was too much. The HOA president resigned. 2 other board members stepped down shortly after. A community vote was held, and for the first time in years, new board members were elected, people who actually cared about the community, the environment, and respecting personal boundaries. And perhaps the biggest shift: the new board officially amended the HOA bylaws, limiting their jurisdiction over private lots, especially those with ecological designations. They didn't just lose their power over my property, they lost it permanently. But I didn't stop there. With the help of the state and my environmental partners, I filed for a conservation easement. That means my land, all 10 acres of it, is now legally registered as a protected conservation zone. It cannot be altered, developed, or cleared without going through the highest level of environmental oversight. Even if I sell the land in the future, the easement stays. It's not just my sanctuary anymore. It's a permanent refuge for birds, deer, trees, and whatever calls this land home in the decades to come. Standing there now, months later, looking at the rows of young saplings swaying in the breeze, I feel something I didn't think I'd feel again: hope. It'll take time for the forest to fully return, maybe years before the canopy is thick again, before the soil feels spongy and wild. But already I've seen sparrows return, landing gently on the new branches. Fox tracks have appeared again near the lake, and just last week I spotted a pair of eagles circling overhead, the same species that used to nest in the old oaks. It was as if they were saying, "We remember this place, we're watching." So what did I learn? Honestly, a lot. I learned that HOA can be challenged, that even the most rigid systems crack under pressure when they're in the wrong. I learned that documents matter, that keeping emails, maps, and permits can make or break your case when you're defending your rights. I learned that nature has allies everywhere, in neighbors, in schools, in agencies that actually care. But most of all, I learned that sometimes the worst thing that happens to you becomes the most powerful story you'll ever tell. What started with chainsaws and heartbreak ended with new growth, new laws, new awareness. The trees may have been cut, but something stronger took root, a movement. So to anyone out there who has ever felt helpless against a system that doesn't listen, to anyone who's watched something beautiful be destroyed by arrogance or ignorance, let this be your reminder: you can fight back, you can rebuild, and you can make it even better than before, because in the end, trees grow back. And when they do, they stand taller, stronger, and they whisper to the wind, "We're still here." If you found this story powerful, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more real-life stories that inspire, shock, and make you think. This is AH Stories, where every tale has truth, and every truth has a voice. Until next time, stay aware, stay grounded, and protect what matters.